Scrub Dog of Alaska by Walt Morey. 6. Things were not the same for Scrub at Smiley Jackson's. He wasn't allowed in the cabin. He was staked to a 10-foot chain like the rest of Jackson's dogs. His only shelter from snow and storm would be his own heavy wolf-gray coat and the hole he'd dig in the snow. He dug the hole the first night, curled up with his nose tucked into the thin fur of his stomach, and let the snow drift over him. Next morning, when Jackson appeared to hitch up the team for a practice run, Scrub knew what was coming. All the dogs were up and waiting expectantly. Jackson took Kino first. He passed Scrub as he led the first dog to the sled. When the two dogs came opposite, Kino stopped. Here was a dog he had not yet disciplined. He had fought every dog in the team to prove his leadership. He would establish his mastery over this one. Kino growled and showed his teeth. Scrub remembered Kino. Now he was not the half-starved, clumsy pup of last summer. He stood several inches above Kino at the shoulders. He was broader, deeper of chest. The clumsiness of puppy days had disappeared. Maturity, food, and loving care had added weight and muscle. He waited, head down, amber eyes looking obliquely up as he measured Kino. Jackson knew Kino must assert his mastery over Scrub. There was no better time than the present. Scrub was still chained and had only a few feet to move. That would make Kino's job easier. Jackson unsnapped the leader's chain and said, "Take him, Kino." Kino lunged at Scrub as he had last summer, as he had at every dog in the team that he'd fought. His sudden attacks had proved successful in the past, but when his teeth snapped together, Scrub was not there. He had dodged Kino's lunge, and as the black dog flashed by, Scrub struck with lightning speed and ripped Kino's shoulder to the bone. Kino whirled, and the two came together, reared on hind legs, fangs slashing. As before, Kino drove for the throat, only to be met by Scrub's fangs. Scrub's greater weight and strength drove him slipping backward through the snow until the chain jerked him up short. Kino did not rush in again. He had felt the strength and quickness of the wolf-gray dog. He became cautious and circled just beyond reach of the chain, looking for an opening, snarling horribly. At the end of his chain, Scrub turned with him, head down, lips lifted, watching and waiting. Jackson said impatiently, "Go on, Kino, get it over with. Take him, take him." Thus encouraged, Kino leaped to attack again. Scrub shot in under the black dog, caught a front leg in his jaws, and jerked Kino forward where he could get at him. In a flash, he flipped Kino over on his back and straddled his chest. His big teeth were at Kino's unprotected throat. Kino, knowing death was but the snap of Scrub's teeth away, relaxed and lay perfectly still. It was a dog's way of admitting defeat and asking for mercy. For a moment, Scrub stood over him, a growl rumbling in his throat, every tooth in his head showing. When he backed off, Kino rolled over, got painfully to his feet, and limped away. Scrub stood there, head high, glaring about at the other dogs. Challenge was in every inch of him. Jackson caught Kino and chained him again. With that ripped shoulder and injured leg, he couldn't be used for at least a week. He stood looking at Scrub angrily, surprised at how easily he'd beaten Kino. Scrub had destroyed Kino as a leader. Now Jackson needed another. He studied the wolf-gray dog, making up his mind. Then he unfastened the chain and led him to Kino's lead spot and buckled him into the harness. "You're the toughest, all right," he growled. "You'd better get to be the smartest in a hurry, or you'll wind up with a bullet between the eyes." Scrub had learned to follow Noble on the team. He had not learned to lead, but when Jackson popped the whip over his back and yelled, he knew exactly where he was going. All night he'd thought of but one thing, the boy and cabin in the clearing. Now that he was not chained and there was no one in front of him, he headed back as fast as his legs would carry him. Jackson's shouts and curses, the cracking of the whip meant nothing. Jackson finally dumped the sled on its side. This acted as a powerful brake that stopped the team. Jackson rushed at Scrub and kicked him. Then he began using the whip. His insane temper was loose, and his one desire was to punish. Scrub could not run away or dodge the lash. He could only crouch and take the beating. Jackson was an expert with the whip, and every swing of his arm cut or raised welts on the cringing dog. When Jackson finally stopped, he'd administered as thorough a beating as he'd ever given an animal. He righted the sled and yelled. Scrub got painfully to his feet and did as he was told. But his ribs ached and his muscles were sore. He burned from a dozen welts and lash cuts. For a time, he barely kept ahead of the team. The worst of the pain finally wore off, and he was able to run again. Scrub was not through making mistakes that first day. They hit a stump and almost wrecked the sled. He didn't turn out far enough, and the sled hit a rock and flipped over. Jackson held his temper until they headed home. They were traveling in the direction of the boy in the cabin in the clearing. The closer they got, the more excited Scrub became. At last, he was returning. He was running faster and faster, showing Jackson a speed he'd never found in a lead dog before. But when Jackson tried to turn him toward Aurora in his own cabin, Scrub ran straight on. Once more, Jackson flipped the sled on its side to stop them. Again, he gave Scrub a sound beating. When they arrived at the cabin and Jackson had the team staked out, he stood looking at Scrub. The dog was lying down, panting. He was near exhaustion and was hurting from the lash burns. "Maybe I'll make a lead dog," Jackson said darkly. "Maybe not. But one thing I know, I'll beat that Martin kid out of your head or I'll kill you." In the weeks that followed, Scrub became a strong lead dog. Jackson was a brutal taskmaster. He had no feeling for a dog. He let Scrub control the team, but he controlled Scrub. This he did by liberal use of his feet and the lash. There was no praise when the dog did well. He simply did not feel the lash then. Scrub lost weight. He was fed but once a day now, and never as much as he wanted, but he became tough and hard. He was always on the chain except when Jackson put him in harness. Kino returned to the team and added strength and speed. He and Scrub had no more trouble. They were a young team. The toughening and discipline required for racing took long hours of hard work. At first, Jackson ran the sled empty. Then, as their strength increased, he began piling on wood for weight. He lengthened the run and shortened the rest stops. Day after day, he brought them, staggering back to Aurora. Scrub no longer headed for the Martins' cabin when they drew near, but Jackson had not beat the memory of the boy out of his mind. Each time they approached the turnoff, Scrub searched hopelessly for a sight of David. Night after night, he howled his loneliness and longing. This brought Jackson with the whip, and finally Scrub's howling stopped. But his mourning was in no way lessened. He curled up, nose tucked into the warm fur of his stomach, and brooded silently. He waited and watched. There would come a time when the man grew careless. This was the most promising team Jackson had ever owned. He bragged about it until finally the owner of the trading post timed him with a stopwatch. He made it in a fraction less than 10 minutes over a 2-mile course. That was almost championship time, and the team was still green. Everyone was impressed. It would be an honor for Aurora to have a championship team, even with a musher like Smiley Jackson. So they watched and hoped, but doubted. The success of any team depends, in great measure, upon the leader. Everyone knew the history of the Scrub of Aurora. David missed Scrub more than anything in his life. He wandered about the cabin, looking out the window at the snow, and said, "Scrub won't have a house. He has to sleep in the snow." "Scrub will be all right," Celia said. "He has a good thick coat. Jackson's dogs always sleep out. It hasn't hurt them." "Ours don't, except when Dad's on the trail. Your father's not Smiley Jackson." "I could sneak up through the brush and look at him." "You keep away from Jackson," Celia warned. "He wouldn't know I was there. I'd stay hidden in the brush. One of the dogs might smell you or see you and start barking. Next thing, Jackson would be out." "What could he do? I'd just be looking." "If he happened to be drunk, there's no telling. You know about his temper." "Going up there is only torturing yourself," Fred said. "I'd like to know how he is, Dad. I can tell you one thing. I was coming over the hill between here and Aurora yesterday, and I saw Jackson coming back from a practice run. Scrub is his new lead dog." "Lead dog?" David said excitedly. "How is he doing? It was rough, but then he's new at it. I've a hunch he'll be all right. So you see, being the leader, Jackson's going to treat him better than the rest." "That's not saying much." "At least it's something," Fred added after a moment. "I'm heading out on the trap line tomorrow morning. You'd better come along if you're going to learn how this is done, so we can lengthen the line next year. Besides, moping around the house won't help. You need something to do to forget." The only time David had ever been on a trap line was when he'd helped his father set out the traps earlier. This was his first time out when they were actually taking fur. There was much to learn. Traps had to be set and reset. Occasionally, they had to move traps to new locations. Baits were cleverly stolen and had to be replenished. At several, the brush and twig camouflage that hid the traps had been ripped away and had to be rebuilt. Each night they spent carefully skinning out the fur that had been taken that day. This work should have made David too tired to think of Scrub, but he remembered the big dog at odd moments. Often on the trail, Noble glanced back, tongue lolling out and lips lifted in a grin the way Scrub used to do. When Ginger nipped Jack, who was in harness in Scrub's place, David had to smile, remembering Scrub's first experience as a sled dog. Every night when they staked out the team, he thought of the howl Scrub put up to come into the cabin with him. He awoke several times each night and thoughtlessly trailed a hand over the side of the bunk. When he found no sharp ears and cold nose, aching loss overwhelmed him. The fifth night, they made Scotty's. He ran an eye over the team and asked, "Where's my friend? Where's Scrub?" David didn't answer. Fred said, "Jackson saw him. We had quite an argument later, but Jackson took the dog." Scotty nodded. "That figured to happen if Jackson laid eyes on him." He was about to say more than glanced at David's face and said nothing. They unhitched and staked out the team in silence. In the warm cabin, Scotty asked, "Well, what's for supper? Anybody for bacon pancakes?" David said nothing. Scotty had jokingly asked Scrub that very question on their last trip. Scrub had pointed his tail at the floor and grinned from ear to ear. Fred said, "That'll be fine." For the first time in the years he'd known Scotty, David wished they'd had something else to eat that night. When they arrived home, Celia said, "My, am I glad you're back. Do you know how long a week is alone in winter? I almost got cabin fever. I wish I could go along." "I don't like being gone so much," Fred said, "but that's trapping." He rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "Dave's doing fine, keeping the cabins cleaned up, cooking, and he's learning to set traps and skin." "What are you getting at?" Celia asked. "There's more to trapping. Learning to be alone is a big part of it." "So, let him start learning. That's in the future." "Not so far," Fred said. "He'll be old enough to run a line alone by next year." "Do you really think so? Other boys have done it." "He's got everything here to do it with," Fred pointed out. The trick of being alone is learning to keep yourself busy at something. It's not as easy as it sounds. You have to learn by yourself. Right here is a good place to start. The two of you can alternate. You can go on the line with me one week, Dave the next. That way you won't be alone so much." "I don't know." Celia looked at David. "Would you mind being alone a week?" "I think it's a great idea," David said. "You go next time. I'll make out fine." "You've never been alone," Celia said uncertainly. "It's time he started," Fred said. "Let him grow up." "Don't worry," David said. "I'll find plenty to do." "Well, all right. I went along before he was born, remember?" Fred smiled. "Be a little like the old times." It was still dark when they left the second morning. Celia, bundled in her parka and with a robe wrapped around her, rode in the basket. Her face looked small and childishly excited, framed in the parka hood. She waved and called, "You be careful here," Fred said. "See you in a week, Dave. Take care." He shouted at Noble. The team lunged into the harnesses and they were off. David cleaned up the breakfast dishes and made his bed. He spent an hour splitting wood and filled the wood box. The snow was soft, the air crisp and sharp. A brittle sun made ice diamonds on every brush and tree. He decided to go for a hike and got into his parka. It was easy traveling, and he went out along the frozen river where Scrub and he had spent much time and learned to walk. A snowshoe rabbit watched him from the edge of the brush, then turned and quickly disappeared. A flock of ptarmigans exploded out of the snow and zoomed across the frozen river. Moose, rabbit, and fox tracks laced the smooth snow basket. Moose, rabbit, and fox tracks laced the smooth snow blanket covering the ice. Then he remembered his father had seen Scrub with Jackson's team near that hill between the cabin and Aurora. He headed for the hill. The hill was several hundred feet high and barren of brush and trees. From the top, he looked over the country dotted with brush patches and a scattering of timber, all heavily laden with snow. At the bottom of a hill, a single set of sled tracks marred the smooth whiteness. If those were Jackson's and he came this way again, he'd be close enough to see Scrub from here. He sat on a rock to wait. The cold crept through his heavy clothing and chilled him. From time to time he walked around the rock, stomped his feet, and swung his arms to keep warm. The heatless sun fell down the sky. Long shadows lay across the snow. David was about to give up and return home when far in the distance a dog team moved on the white expanse. It crept steadily forward. The faint crack of a driver's whip rode the silence. Smiley Jackson's nasal voice floated up to him. David squatted behind the rock and watched. The struggling team drew near. The sled was loaded with great chunks of wood to make the dogs work harder. He recognized Scrub in the lead. His big head was down. He was digging in with all his strength. As was every other dog, Jackson was shouting. The whip snaked out again and popped over the dogs' straining backs. David wanted to rush down, snatch the whip from Jackson, and use it on the man. The team passed beneath him, rounded the base of the hill, and was out of sight. David was back at the same spot the next day. He saw the team come into sight, struggling as before. The whip popped, and Jackson shouted. They stopped at the foot of the hill to untangle one of the dogs. David studied Scrub. He looked tired and unhappy. His sharp ears were down. His mouth was open, panting. Even at this distance, David could see Scrub had lost weight. A minute later, the tangled dog was freed. Jackson cracked the whip and shouted. The team struggled on and disappeared. David thought about Scrub the rest of the day. That night, after he'd eaten, he put all the scraps in a sack, put on his parka, and went off to the starlit night toward Aurora. Jackson's cabin was about a quarter of a mile from Aurora. David stole through protective brush to within 100 feet. He crouched behind a bush and studied the cabin. There was a light in the window. Smoke drifted from the chimney. He watched and listened for several minutes, but there was no sound from the cabin. The dogs were dark humps curled up in the snow. David tried to figure which one was Scrub, but they all looked alike. He stole forward, silently, hoping they would not start up a racket. The first dog raised his head and looked at him, then curled up again. The second was black. He guessed that would be Kino. He passed the next and the next. He carefully placed his feet. His carefully placed feet scarcely whispered in the snow. Each dog looked up at David. Not one barked. The next head to lift was big and broad, with sharp-pointed ears. It lunged to his feet. David dropped to his knees, grabbed Scrub's muzzle, and stifled the glad bark. "No!" he whispered. "Be quiet, quiet!" Scrub whined and pawed at David in a frenzy of excitement. He thrust his head toward David, and the boy scratched his ears. The moment he let go of Scrub's muzzle, the dog began licking his face and whimpering. David opened the sack of scraps, sat in the snow, and fed Scrub. While the dog gobbled down the food, the boy's hands explored over his body. "You're thin," he whispered. "I can feel your ribs, but your muscles are hard as rock." Scrub waved his tail wildly, whined, and shoved his head against David's chest. "I miss you too," David whispered. He held the dog's head between his hands and pressed his face against the cold, furry forehead. The unusual activity and the boy's whispering roused the other dogs. They began to stand up and watch. Any moment one might bark and set off the whole bunch. David patted Scrub and whispered, "I've got to go now. I'll come again soon." He hurried off toward the brush. Before he got halfway, Scrub's long, mournful howl rose in the night. David glanced back. Scrub was sitting on his tail, nose pointed at the stars, while he poured out his grief at being left behind. David started back to quiet him. The cabin door flew open, and Jackson emerged with the ever-handy whip. "Shut up!" he shouted. "Shut up!" Scrub paid no attention. Jackson yelled again, then he ran at the dog, cursing. He lashed him with the whip, and Scrub's howls of grief turned into howls of pain. He dodged about, trying to escape, but the short chain hampered him, and Jackson's aim was perfect. The lash was cutting unmercifully, and the man was shouting with every swing. Hardly aware of what he was doing, David rushed at Jackson. He charged at the man full tilt from behind and sent him sprawling. He grabbed the whip with both hands and tried to tear it loose. Jackson struggled to his feet, dragging David with him. He was much too strong for the boy. He tore the whip from David's hands, and his big fist crashed into the boy's face and knocked him backward into the snow. David staggered up, sick and dizzy. The taste of blood was in his mouth. He dived for the whip. Again, Jackson's fist smashed him back in the snow. David tried to get up, but all strength was gone from his arms and legs. He heard Scrub snarling and lunging at his chain. The excitement had got to the rest of the team. They added their voices to the din. David rolled onto his back and tried to sit up. That moment, the lash exploded in his face. It felt like a white-hot iron had been forced against his cheek. He threw his hands over his face to protect his eyes. The lash came again and again. He felt the sting through the backs of his mittens and the thickness of the parka across his chest and shoulders. Jackson was beating him as he would one of his dogs. Under the rain of blows, David got shakily to his feet. Jackson's hands gripped him. His perpetually grinning face was shoved close. The reek of whiskey was on his breath. "You sneaking half-breed, come to steal my dog." "I only came to see him," David managed. "Trying to steal my dog." Jackson's open hand slashed across his face. "I ever catch you here again, I'll kill you." He hurled David from him, and the boy sprawled in the snow. He scrambled up and stumbled away. Scrub began to mourn his departure at the top of his lungs. Then came the crack of the whip. Scrub's mourning turned to howls of pain again. David ran blindly through the night, trying to shut out the sound of Scrub's crying. And that is the end of chapter 6.